Russia is helping Iran with attacks on U.S. facilities. Another aircraft carrier is joining, while another one was destroyed. Rumors about U.S. ground troops are becoming more concrete, and Trump is demanding the unconditional surrender of the Iranian regime. We'll discuss this and all other important topics in this Iran war situation report. Holy cow! Now save the most with my code at Holy. Israel reports that it has now carried out more than 2,500 attacks and used 6,000 weapons. 80% of Iran's air defense has been destroyed. And we can see here in the videos, in my opinion, this was likely loitering munition that was used here. It's also interesting that this was deployed. Here we can clearly see an air defense system being hit. That means the Israelis are showing us images of the damage they have actually caused. In addition, the Israelis report that they have now established air superiority and that missiles have largely been suppressed, as well as Iran's ability to launch missiles. They are now moving on to the next phase, which targets the regime itself. One way to establish air superiority was through attacks on Iranian air bases. Here are satellite images that clearly show how, at an Air Force base, systematic attacks were carried out at various points. Bombs were dropped here not only to block the runway, but also the side paths. An aviation expert would know the correct term for that, which I've just forgotten. So these are paved paths here, which aren't meant or suitable for takeoff, but so that the planes can move on them. But if the plane is small enough, at least in theory, a mission could be launched from here, and we can see that there have also been impacts here. Then we have Politico, and they write that CENTCOM, which is the central command responsible for the region on the American side. They have requested additional intelligence officers, which in turn implies that they are now preparing for a longer conflict, because otherwise that wouldn't be necessary in the middle of a campaign that only lasts a few weeks. Meanwhile, the Israeli armed forces continue to carry out attacks on the arms industry, because the point here is not only to prevent Iran's ability to launch weapons, but of course also to prevent rebuilding. And Israeli forces are also attacking ammunition depots. There was also another attack on Parchin. Work on missiles and drones is being carried out there. However, until 2003 nuclear weapons were also developed there. And this has now been attacked at least for the second time in the current war. On the Iranian side, missile attacks have decreased by 90% since the beginning of the war. Drone attacks have also dropped drastically. However, there it's only by 83% currently. The Israelis expect the attacks to stabilize. That doesn't mean the Israelis expect them to stop, but only that they will drop to a very low level and stay there. I had already talked about this in the past. It won't be possible to prevent the Iranians from launching a rocket from time to time with 100% certainty, but it will just keep getting harder. With every day, with every hour, it becomes harder for the Iranians to launch a significant salvo, and the fewer rockets there are, the easier it is in principle to intercept those same rockets. Then we have footage of a cluster munition deployment from one of the rockets, and that's an absolutely terrifying shot. I'll speed it up a bit so we can see the full extent of it. Here we can see into how many pieces the warhead breaks apart. It looks like roughly 40 or 50 projectiles here, and we can see the impact on the ground, what it looks like when they hit. And we can see here that even these signs remain standing. That shows we're dealing with relatively small warheads that mainly have a fragmentation effect. And here we have to be clear, this is being used for area attacks against cities. The purpose is to cause casualties. By normal assessment, this is clearly a war crime, because military targets are not being targeted here. In the past, for example, the Iranians carried out clear attacks on Israeli military targets. For example, on intelligence bases, on military bases, or similar targets. In this case, it's simply terror when an area weapon is fired into a city. The attacks are also continuing against the United Arab Emirates. But what's interesting is that the number of attacks is constantly decreasing. At first, there are still over 100 drones being used daily. but now only single-digit numbers of rockets are being used. On the first day, there were over 100 rockets fired at the United Arab Emirates. Now, however, we see that the numbers being used are now consistently in the single digits. On the 5th, we had 6 ballistic missiles, and I mixed one up. Yes, I did. And on the 6th, there were 9. So, from 6, it went back up to 9 ballistic missiles, which confirms what I said. The Iranians will probably still be able to do this for quite some time, to fire smaller salvos, but not on such a large scale anymore. The total number of both drones used, and especially the missiles used, is dropping drastically. There were also further attacks on Qatar. Here as well, the number is dropping sharply. 4 ballistic missiles were used in this case. And attacks on Saudi Arabia are also continuing. Saudi Arabia reports shooting down cruise missiles and drones. How calmly and safely one sleeps probably currently depends on air defense in the region. But even if the missile alarm doesn't go off, that doesn't automatically mean you'll sleep well. But you can change that if you use today's sponsor, because they can help you with that. We all want to stay healthy. Most people exercise and pay attention to their diet. But when it comes to sleep, it's often neglected. So you end up lying on an old mattress and a mediocre pillow, even though we spend about a third of our lives in bed. A good mattress can make the difference between waking up refreshed or feeling exhausted. When I used to visit Germany, I often slept really badly. Ever since there's an Emma Elite air grid in my parents' guest room, it's a completely different experience. And here in Panama, my head rests every night on the Emma Elite support pillow. I'm pretty sure I've never had a better pillow myself. And Emma doesn't just make mattresses, but also beds, pillows, blankets, and basically everything for the bedroom. So basically the complete setup if you want to really get your sleep situation sorted out. Important for you. Emma is currently running their Easter sale until Saturday. On the 4th, many products are up to 50% off. With my discount code, HeinrichsLiebes, you save an additional 5%. So that's extra on top of the already discounted offers. And now, the point that really matters to me. Emma is so confident that you'll be satisfied that you can try sleeping on it risk-free for up to 100 nights, including free delivery, and, if necessary, free pickup. You can try it in daily life with no pressure, and the mattress core has a 10-year warranty. So check out Emma through the link in the video description, and remember, with HeinrichsLiebes, you get an extra 5% discount in addition to the Easter offers, which are only valid until April 6th. The war also continues at sea. Interestingly, Iranian cargo ships are still using the Strait of Hormuz, while ships from other nations are no longer passing through. It will be interesting to see if and when other nations will take action here. Because, as I said, here we have Reuters reporting on 2 Iranian cargo ships. They passed through the strait, including from Bandar Abbas, without any consequences. This is particularly noteworthy because at the same time, a tugboat from the United Arab Emirates was on its way to salvage a damaged ship. And this tugboat was hit by 2 anti-ship missiles. And according to reports, all 8 crew members on board were killed in this attack. That means, while the Iranians are freely using the strait and the waters as they please with their cargo ships, they themselves are attacking civilian ships of other nations. Meanwhile, the U.S. has hit the Iranian quote-unquote aircraft carrier, Iris Shahid Bagheri, which then caught fire. We can see the outlines here. Technically speaking, it's an aircraft carrier. The Iranians themselves refer to it as a drone carrier. From on board, they have deployed both drones and helicopters. And here we have a shot taken from the shore, where you can see the ship in flames. The Shahid Bagheri is this ship here. It was converted from a container ship that was fitted with a flight deck. And this here also seems to be an elevator. So it actually seems to have something below deck as well. But while this is technically an aircraft carrier, since planes can take off and land on it, even if probably only unmanned ones, in terms of efficiency, it's really not worth mentioning. The type of missions and the frequency of combat missions that can be carried out by such a converted ship are no comparison to serious purpose-built units. And accordingly, the combat value of such a ship is very limited. But as the Americans make clear, they want to destroy the entire fleet. Let's move on to the axis of resistance. There we have Hezbollah, which is now reporting that more and more clashes are taking place between the Israeli forces and Hezbollah. However, it seems to be at a relatively low intensity. That doesn't change the fact that the Israelis have now suffered losses. Of course, there have also been losses on the side of Hezbollah. Hezbollah has now also sent the Radwan unit. That is an elite unit within Hezbollah. This unit had been withdrawn north of the Litani River because of the ceasefire agreement. And now, according to media reports, Hezbollah has apparently given the order to move them back south to confront the Israelis accordingly. Israel has now entered at least 10 positions in southern Lebanon. In my last situation report, I talked about how the Israelis intend to push Hezbollah back so as not to leave hills, vantage points, and dominant geographical positions to Hezbollah, so that they can't launch direct attacks into Israel. That is the primary objective of this occupation. And the Israelis had announced that they would do this. However, there are also attacks using standoff weapons. In this case, drones. This is being reported by Hezbollah against defense companies. Accordingly, here as well, rockets are being used against concentrations of Israeli troops. And the Israelis also report that they have already attacked several hundred Hezbollah targets. So while this is a mutual exchange of blows, Hezbollah is coming under pressure on another front. It's not just the Lebanese government that has banned the armed wing of Hezbollah. Now, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran is also being banned in Lebanon, and its members are being deported. So now, the armed forces in Lebanon have actually been instructed to arrest the members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps so that they can then be deported. That means support from Iran will also be stopped. At the same time, it became known that Lebanon has lifted visa-free entry for Iranian citizens, so no new personnel can be sent anymore. Lebanon is obviously using this phase of Iran's weakness to free itself from Iranian influence. Regarding the attacks on the Iranian regime itself, there was an attack today on Khamenei's bunker, apparently because, according to Israeli sources, it was used by other high-ranking individuals. Khamenei himself was not in these bunkers during the attack on him, and therefore could be killed without bunker-busting bombs. Now the attack was carried out on his bunker complex itself, which was reportedly used by high-ranking Iranian personnel. At least that's what the Israelis say. Attacks are also continuing on police stations. We have a whole series of reports from various regions. The police stations there, the National Police, is the first authority deployed against uprisings and unrest, so the aim is to weaken them accordingly. That means possible demonstrations can expect less resistance, and that is likely one of the main points. In addition, positions of the Revolutionary Guards are being attacked. We have received reports of such attacks on the positions of the Revolutionary Guards. We've heard from various sources that bases and barracks are involved. They are being attacked at various locations. Interestingly, a mechanized brigade of the Revolutionary Guards was also attacked. That means the conventional military capabilities of the Revolutionary Guards are also being weakened. State media continue to be attacked as well, especially those under the control of the Revolutionary Guards. Here, obviously, to reduce both coordination and the influence on the population. Trump says the U.S. should choose the next leader together with Iran. That's relatively interesting. And he also encourages the Kurds to launch an offensive into Iran. He stated in an interview that the leader should be chosen together with Iran. That is, of course, as I said, very, very optimistic. And he encourages the Kurds to advance in Iran. And in doing so, he also called Iraqi Kurdish leaders. And they were told, either you are with the US and Israel or with Iran. However, the Iraqi Kurdish leaders just last year signed an agreement with Tehran about the border, where they committed themselves to controlling the border on their side, in order to prevent infiltration by fighters and smuggling into Iran itself. And that's why they naturally fear retaliation if they now participate with the Americans in destabilizing Iran. And accordingly, there are already threats coming from Tehran, should they dare to get involved in something like this. But that's not all. There are already the first recordings of attacks on bases of Iranian Kurds located in Iraq. These are already taking place. We already have attacks here with drones and ballistic missiles on Iraqi bases. The situation is also heating up in Balochistan. The Baloch rebels have become more active and have carried out more attacks. There, it's mainly separatists. Here too, it must be understood that they are not seeking regime change, but rather want to break away from Iran. And what's particularly interesting is the report we have here. It says that the 82nd Airborne Division of the U.S. has canceled a planned exercise. That's an airborne unit, a unit that typically gets deployed very early in a conflict and can also be relocated very quickly anywhere in the world. Of course, this fuels speculation about whether the 82nd Airborne is now canceling its training in order to be deployed in the Persian Gulf. Basically, it could be deployed and put into action relatively quickly. However, this would mostly be possible only in isolated locations, since resupply would take a very long time, especially the resupply of additional personnel. So, starting an invasion of Iran with them now would put them at a drastic disadvantage, without any expectation that they would receive support quickly enough. So that makes a ground operation against Iran itself very unlikely. However, there might be an operation against the Gulf Islands or something similar, because there, of course, they could have local superiority, and because of American air superiority, supplies could also be guaranteed there, while the Iranians themselves would hardly be able to bring supplies to islands where the Americans are already present or already engaged in combat. They could possibly be used for that. So it is actually possible that the 82nd Airborne will move on to attacks on Iran itself. But as I said, the expectation would be that this is limited to islands, not the mainland itself. Trump himself goes even further with his demands. He says there will be no deal with Iran except for unconditional surrender. Of course, that's an interesting thing to do at this stage. That makes negotiations more difficult at the current time. As for support, we have interesting reports from Ukraine. There, they say they are ready to help, but in return, they are asking for missiles for the Patriot system, since most ballistic missiles can no longer be intercepted. Due to the loss of launch vehicles, the bigger threat right now is the Shahed drones. And although you could theoretically use the Patriot system against them, it would be a complete waste. There, the Ukrainians say, at the expense of their own needs, they are happy to help, but they would like something in return. And accordingly, they would like Patriot missiles in the event that interceptors, the interceptor drones, are delivered to shoot down Shahed drones. Whether anything will come of that could be interesting. At the same time, reinforcements are arriving, as the French aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle was recently photographed crossing the Strait of Gibraltar heading east. So now it's on its way into the Mediterranean, which in turn means that it will be off the coast of Israel in 2 to 3 days and can participate in the defense of Cyprus, of course together with its escort ships. At the same time, there are indications that the Gerald R. Ford may have entered the Suez Canal and is thus on its way to the Red Sea. The Gerald R. Ford was certainly useful at the beginning in defending against drone attacks on Israel, because from the eastern Mediterranean, it can shoot down drones on sight, and with appropriate aerial refueling, its aircraft can also participate in attacks on Iran. However, the flight time is unnecessary, and especially if you have an aircraft carrier, it makes a lot of sense to move it to a location from which attacks can be carried out more quickly. And that seems to be the case now. I haven't seen any confirmation yet that it's true, so it might still be a false report. But if it's now on its way to the Red Sea, then it will be in the Gulf of Oman in a few days, where it can then participate much more effectively in attacks on Iran, and, together with the other American aircraft carrier, intervene on the eastern side of Iran. The whole thing then makes sense, of course, because in the West, you have the Israelis with their air force. You don't really need an aircraft carrier there to provide support on that side. Accordingly, the second aircraft carrier would make much more sense in the Gulf of Oman. At the same time, what was actually already expected is now becoming clear. Russia is helping Iran with targeting data. As I have reported in the last situation reports, there have been remarkably accurate hits on American military bases. Among them, radar equipment was apparently hit several times, and there were already suspicions that the Iranians might be getting help from the Russians here. Since the Iranians themselves only have 2 military satellites and the quality of those is unclear, It is therefore much more likely that the Russians provided the Iranians with high-resolution data so that they could set the target data for their missiles and thus disable the radar devices. At the same time, according to CNN, U.S. intelligence agencies believe that China is also preparing to provide assistance. However, regarding finance, spare parts, and missile components, they are still somewhat holding back. But we have to be clear here. The U.S. has helped the Ukrainians in attacks on Russia, and Russia has not only helped the Houthis in the past, providing them with targeting data for attacks on ships in the Red Sea, but now Russia is taking the opportunity to retaliate and take revenge. That was to be expected and was also suspected. So this shouldn't really be surprising. It must also be said, for Russia and China, this is now a good opportunity to weaken the U.S. because every missile that is fired has to be replaced. The offensive weapons are therefore no longer available for attacks on China or to hand over to the Ukrainians. The defensive ones, on the other hand, also have to be replaced. And in the future, the Gulf states, together with Ukraine and the U.S. military, will be competing for reorders. That means, even if the U.S. can meet its needs again in a reasonably timely manner, the Gulf states will be dissatisfied because they get nothing. That helps Russia, and that helps China. And if the Ukrainians are left out because Trump considers relations with the Gulf states and his own military more important, then the Ukrainians won't get any more air defense missiles. Either way, it helps Russia and China. And that's why it's not surprising that both nations have an interest in seeing Iran fight more effectively and cause bigger problems for the U.S. We're also seeing developments diplomatically, and now Azerbaijan is withdrawing its diplomats from Iran after an attack on an Azerbaijani airport, and a school has also been hit. In Nakhchivan, I believe that's what it's called, in this exclave. That's where the drone attack took place. The Iranians deny that they were responsible, but the Azerbaijanis obviously still believe it. Accordingly, there are now recordings, geolocated near the border, showing that Azerbaijani troops are being moved to the border. And what is especially provocative, as reported here by the BBC, is that Aliyev, the Azerbaijani president, says that independent Azerbaijan is a place of hope for Azerbaijanis in Iran. In the last situation report, I mentioned that more than 20 million Azerbaijanis live in Iran, which is significantly more than in Azerbaijan itself. So, more Azerbaijanis live in Iran than in the country that is named after them, and that this always causes a bit of unease in Tehran, and always raises concerns about whether Azerbaijan might somehow make territorial claims in this regard to annex these areas of Iran. And so that's a point between both nations that usually gets swept under the rug, because Azerbaijan has no interest in upsetting Tehran. But at the same time, of course, they also don't want to permanently sever ties with their own compatriots, whom they in Baku definitely see as such. And now Aliyev has broken the taboo. He explicitly says that the Azerbaijanis in Iran have a connection to Baku. Of course, this has to be understood as a diplomatic gesture. He wanted to send a message to Tehran with this. And ultimately, we can't understand it any other way than that. In this way, he is to some extent threatening the territorial integrity of Iran itself. And then we have more information about the school that was hit, with a higher number of deaths. Once again, we have the New York Times here. I've already referred to their geolocation in the past. The New York Times is now committing to saying that the data suggests it was the U.S. I already mentioned this here on the channel a few days ago, that if we look at the data about where the attack happened, this is where the elementary school is, and this is where the Revolutionary Guard facility is. If, according to their own statements, there is a particularly important missile brigade that is supposed to block the Strait of Hormuz, then that was a logical target for the Americans. And if there is a school right next to it, it doesn't rule it out that it was some kind of false flag operation by the Iranians, or that maybe something went wrong on the Iranian side after all, like an anti-aircraft missile going off course or something similar. But based on the available satellite images, the damage is consistent with what you would expect from U.S. weapon systems, which destroyed Revolutionary Guard buildings right next to it with the same precision, and hit this building as well. as if it were part of the base. Interestingly, the article also states that what is now a school was actually once part of the base. I had already pointed out in previous videos that if we look at the walls, it looks as if this was part of this facility here. It has been proven that this is a facility of the Revolutionary Guards, and therefore a mix-up is possible. And while the school has been there for several years now, it was actually once part of the base. And obviously, something went wrong somewhere. Someone forgot, didn't notice, or ignored the fact that it had become a school in the meantime. As I said, I had already mentioned this in the past. The big question, of course, is it a war crime? First of all, it must be stated very clearly that I think the Iranians are now talking about more than 160 dead, most of them children. The statements are that they were all civilians. That is tragic, and the loss of these lives cannot be justified by anything. That much up front. But when it comes to the question of whether it is a war crime, under international law, it is not automatically considered one. I have said this before. It is a war crime if one of three conditions is met. A. The school was deliberately attacked, meaning it was known to be a school and was still attacked. So far, there is no evidence of that. The next would be if the attack was carried out deliberately in a disproportionate manner. That means a large number of civilian deaths would have been knowingly accepted for a minor target. For example, we could mention some colonel here, not even a general, not even the commander-in-chief. Some high-ranking officer was at the school to bring his daughter there. At that moment, the school would have been attacked to kill this officer, fully accepting that possibly 100 other school children and the teachers would be killed in the process. That would also be a war crime, because one would say that a high-ranking officer, but not even a general, does not justify the killing of 100 or 200 civilians. And the third option would be that the attack was carried out blindly. In English, that would be indiscriminate, meaning without regard for what was hit. You just fire roughly in some direction. In our example now, that's like the cluster munitions fired on rockets toward Israel. In this case, it would also be a war crime. That means, as long as independent investigations do not conclude that one of these three conditions has been met, it would not be a war crime despite the terrible human suffering. Just to clarify that here. Of course, I can't anticipate the results of any independent investigations here. Theoretically, there is still a small possibility that it wasn't the Americans. But if this isn't your first time here, you know that I've already said in the past that in my opinion, there is a high probability that the Americans were responsible for it. Meanwhile, the threat of terrorism is becoming more concrete. I've already addressed this as well. I had warned that Israeli targets and Jewish targets, or Jewish sites and individuals, are exposed to an increased risk of terrorism. And now we have the report from the UK that 4 men have been arrested, as they are accused of having spied on the Jewish community for the Iranian intelligence services. So it's not just any Israeli target, but actually Jews, simply because they are Jews. This is a consequence of this conflict that is currently looming. And then we have a recording that is breathtaking. So far, I haven't heard any final verification. Just to clarify that. But this is supposed to show the downing of one of the American F-15s. This one right here. And that's the interesting part, because that's the Kuwaiti F-18 that shot down 3 F-15Es over Kuwait. And if this footage is real, as I said, I haven't seen any credible analysis that disputes it. But I don't want to rule out that possibility. Then the shoot-down would have happened at visual range. It's one thing to shoot down an aircraft at beyond visual range, so at 40, 60, 80 kilometers because of a misidentification. But this looks like a distance where the pilot should have been able to visually recognize that what was in front of him was an F-15 and not an Iranian fighter jet. And yet, he still carried out the shoot-down. It will also be interesting to see what comes out of the investigation in the end. Let's get to the conclusion. At this point, we can clearly say that Israel's goal in this war is clear. They aim to destroy as much of the nuclear weapons and missile infrastructure as possible. At the same time, they want to weaken the regime by attacking the structures themselves, meaning the personnel, command centers, and the units that support the regime. The goal would then be either to overthrow the regime or at least create chaos through separatists. The first option is preferable, as it would allow close relations with a friendly ruler in Tehran. But we have to be clear, from an Israeli perspective, The second option would not be the absolutely worst solution, because that would then prevent the regime from having particularly large capacities for international adventures. What if, after this war, the Beylik in the east of Iran have captured a territory and are keeping the Iranian armed forces busy there, while the Kurds are doing the same in the west? Then Iran would certainly have fewer capacities to, for example, smuggle money and weapons to Hezbollah. That means it must be recognized that the Israelis would certainly prefer a change to a pluralistic democracy. But if they don't get that, then at least it can be assumed that they wouldn't mind if separatism gains ground. We already discussed in the last video that Marco Rubio told the American congressman that they themselves are not arming the Kurds, but he couldn't say what the Israelis are doing. As far as the US is concerned, the goals are much more erratic. If you don't want to keep mowing the lawn in the future, meaning flying into Iran once or twice a week to bomb something where the Iranians are trying to rebuild, then you'll need someone on the other side to negotiate with. But you can't achieve that either by declaring you'll choose the next leader, or by demanding unconditional surrender, capitulation. And currently, there is still no sign of concession from Iran, even though its offensive capabilities are constantly declining. The Iranians may not have many warships left. That one supply ship is now interned in Sri Lanka, and of the 3 Shahid Soleimani-class frigates that were still left, I haven't heard what has become of them either, but they probably won't have any warships left soon. The number of missile launches is decreasing every day. Drone launches are becoming fewer, and the depots are being destroyed. That means Iran's ability to inflict pain on others is slowly diminishing. But of course, that doesn't mean they have to capitulate right away. It will be interesting to see whether the 82nd Airborne will actually be deployed, and if so, where. As I said, at the moment, these are just rumors and a few indications, but nothing that would be concrete in any way. That we could say we can really expect to see an airborne landing on some Iranian-controlled islands in the Persian Gulf in the next 7 or 10 days. The fact that Russia and China are supporting this shouldn't be surprising. And at the same time, it should make it clear to Trump what he can expect from Putin. We'll see if this leads to any political consequences. And while the Iranian Navy ceases to exist and its missiles and drones become rarer, currently nothing indicates that this will be over soon. And at least for now, there is also no serious attempt to forcibly reopen the Strait of Hormuz. We have the American statement. We actually expect that something should start moving from the Gulf states, if only out of self-interest. But so far, nothing is visible in this regard. And that's it for the situation report at this point. If you enjoyed it, I'd appreciate a thumbs up. Leave a comment if you have something to add. And if you're new here, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss future situation reports. Tomorrow at 8 p.m. German time, we have the next live stream followed by a Q&A session. That means if you have questions about the topic, you can ask them tomorrow. We will also give another situation report on the Ukraine war there, so you can stay up to date. But of course, we will also continue to cover this topic here. At this point, I'd also like to point out my other channels. There's still activity on my personal channel, Torsten Heinrich, on Hoplafil, and on Extras. The links are in the description. But that's it for today. Thanks for your attention. See you soon. Thanks also to the supporters through memberships here, as well as on Patreon. I would especially like to thank Lieutenant Colonel Mahamori, as well as Lieutenants Jans vom Eck, Uwe die Fremd, nickname Tubib, Karsten Schultz, Tequila 42, Alex Rosenthal, Mad Best, Vision Sound Lab, Sick Writer, Beartainment, Robert Veal, Matt Burke, Mutter 1000 Janescu, Anti-X, Sasha Miller, Cunningham 4500, and you Stress. Thank you very much. Without you, this would not be possible.